All right. So welcome everyone to our May virtual Rehabber Club event. And my name is Katie Totman, and I work for the Office of Historic Preservation. And today, in celebration of Preservation Month, we have some awesome ladies from Ford, Powell, and Carson who are going to talk to us today about best practices in historic preservation, and they're going to give some examples of the firm's work and their work. And I'm really excited to see what they're going to share. And so we've got Anna Now, Rachel Wright, and Allison Chambers who are going to be talking with us today. And just some quick housekeeping housekeeping things. If you have a question, please drop it in the chat. And Stephanie and I are going to be monitoring those. If you want, there is an option where you can send the chat to everyone. If you can do that, that way both Steph and I can see it pretty quickly. Otherwise, you can also drop them in the Q&A function. That's perfectly fine too. And we will get to questions once the presentation is concluded. So please, if you have questions, drop them there and we will get to them afterwards. And the presentation is also being recorded, so that will be uploaded to our department's YouTube channel probably later next week. And then I will also be sending out an email to everybody who had signed up to register with a link to that video and also a survey for today's presentation and details on the next one for June. So with that said, I will let the ladies take it away.
Thank you so much, Katie. So yeah, I'll get us started. I'm Anna Now, and I'm a senior associate with FPC. So I'm an architectural conservator and architectural historian, and work as a project manager and kind of materials preservation expert here in the office. And I'll pass it over to my colleague here to my left.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Chambers, and I'm also a senior associate at FPC. Been here about 14 years, and my specialty is historic preservation. It's what I went to architecture school and preservation school for. I knew I was nerdy about it from the beginning. So excited to be able to share some of our experiences and lessons learned with you guys. Ms. Rachel?
And I'm Rachel Wright. I'm a principal at Ford, Powell, and Carson. Like Allison, I am both a preservationist and a licensed architect, and super fortunate to work with both Anna and Allison on some pretty amazing existing historic buildings in Texas.
Yeah, and so we're kind of part of the core of the preservation studio at FPC, but we're also a multidisciplinary architecture firm. So in addition to preservation, we provide design for new construction for a wide variety of clients, from public to private, and we do master planning, residential, as well as interior design. So but we obviously love our preservation side here at FPC, and our project experience is also pretty wide and varied in scale. We do quite a bit of public projects for places like the Texas Governor's Mansion, as well as our City Hall here in town, which is nearing final completion, which Allison is very excited about. And we also do things for projects for historic churches, for clients like museums and universities, as well as private businesses. The one thing we kind of don't do is residential scale preservation, but I know for any of you listening who are hoping to get kind of tips or ideas for your own historic properties, if they are historic homes, we do hope that a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is pretty transferable to that situation as well, because preservation kind of ideas and practices are pretty universal across projects. So I wanted to get us started with a little bit about kind of the basics of preservation terminology and where we tend to start our work from. And that really comes down to this kind of key document, which is the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. I know a lot of people watching may be already familiar with this. I hope that you are, but These are really the fundamental concepts about maintaining and repairing and replacing historic materials in existing buildings. And I like to think of them as a real framework for discussion, a jumping off point. They're not hard and fast rules because every project is unique, every site is unique, and requires an individualized approach. But they do outline the four kind of general types of treatment approaches to buildings. So preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples of projects in our portfolio that fall into these different categories. So preservation is really the ideal. This is your maintenance and repair of an existing historic materials and retention of the building's form as it's evolved over time. And so this is really how we approach most of our work at the mission churches. So you can see the Sacristy of San Jose on the upper left, where we did a preservation campaign on the exterior, where we replaced some of the deteriorated mortar. We worked with a stone conservator to take care of some needed repairs of the carved stone. Then rehabilitation, which is really the most common approach to preservation, and the vast majority of our projects fall under this umbrella, focuses on the retention of a building's historic character while allowing for necessary changes to the building for its continued use, or finding a new compatible use for a building. So for example, the Pearl Stable project at the Pearl Brewery redevelopment was a great example of this. Originally a stable building and turned into a lovely modern event space. And then restoration, which aims to take a property or a feature back to a particular period of time, or what we often call a period of significance. This is, a fairly common strategy for places like house museums. So the Governor's Mansion, which you see one of the interior rooms of on the bottom center there. When we did that restoration, which was a post-disaster, post-fire, we really aimed to bring those public spaces that you might see when you go on a tour there back to the condition they were before the fire, which were already curated to a particular kind of period of time in the building's history. And then finally, reconstruction, which is certainly the least common approach to preservation. This is when you recreate vanished or non-surviving portions or an entire building sometimes for interpretive purposes. So if anyone's ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, a lot of what you see there is a reconstruction from the 1930s. But we have a kind of example of this out at Shinati in Marfa. We've worked with the Shinati Foundation on several projects out there. Our office has. A lot of the old barracks and other kind of utilitarian buildings that served that when it was a fort. And so one of the recent projects, the Robert Irwin Gallery out there, which you see on the bottom right, was in large part a reconstruction of some kind of remaining walls there. So base window openings and things like that we were able to reconstruct. So those are the four approaches, but most projects really kind of fall somewhere between a lot of these terminologies, these approaches. So for example, at the missions, in the interiors, we also do rehabilitation work because we have to make sure that the parishes have the modern infrastructure and the things that they need, such as air conditioning or lighting or sound systems for the services. So obviously that's not original to the building, but is an important component of those spaces. And then the Park Service also provides, the next slide, Rachel. Thank you. Some really useful information besides the standards. There's preservation briefs. We reference these. We often reference them in our specifications for projects. So for our contractors and subcontractors to look at, they're really useful for anyone interested in preservation. There are currently 50 preservation briefs, I believe, and they cover a wide range of historic building materials and features. So here you see the stained glass preservation brief. They also have things on, looking at your entire building envelope, looking at historic brick or plaster or like cast iron facades. So lots of good information out there. And then the kind of last component of this little introductory bit is making sure that you understand any potential landmark designations that your property may have. So in the United States, we're quite different from a lot of the rest of the world in terms of how preservation regulation works. Local regulations are the strongest in terms of protecting historic buildings. So here, of course, in San Antonio, that's the Office of Historic Preservation that oversees this. So they have great resources online where you can go and look up your property by address and see if it has a designation of some kind or is in a historic district. And you, of course, want to work with the appropriate regulatory body, be it the Historic Design Review Commission or sometimes the Texas Historical Commission. They also have their own landmark statuses on the state level. So for example, we often work with them for the missions because they're Texas State Antiquities landmark. So anything we do there has to be permitted through the Texas Historical Commission. And then there is, of course, the National Register of Historic Places, so the federal scale. These don't really come with any it doesn't tell you can or cannot do anything to your historic building. It's more of an honorary designation. But one of the benefits of having a National Register property is that it does allow you to go after historic tax credits and often certain types of grants and other funding. So certainly a worthwhile designation from that perspective. Next slide, please. And so the first thing that we do when we start any new project, really the first step to any preservation project, we think, is to do a complete conditions assessment of your building. So for us, this usually involves producing a detailed report that provides a holistic assessment of a building and all of its features, looking at materials, looking at infrastructure like air conditioning or electrical systems, the level of maintenance in the building, and also changes over time. So we work with a team of consultants to accomplish this, so engineers and other types of professionals. And it often includes some level of research about the history of a building and that evolution over time. So the goal of a conditions assessment is to not only establish what the existing conditions are, provide that survey of all the features and elements, it's also to identify the causes of and mechanisms of deterioration, and then make recommendations for repairs and treatments. So here you see an example from one of our assessments at one of the historic buildings on the Trinity campus, an example of one of the interior character-defining features, which are these Linford, really lovely crafted wood doors. So you kind of go through a little description of that feature, you look at and describe its condition, and then make recommendations for treatments. And we tend to establish a kind of grading metric for each feature or element when we do these assessments. So say we might say something's in excellent condition or good or fair or poor, and this allows us to prioritize recommended treatments. And we find that generally one of the best places to start if you're going to start looking at your building from a holistic standpoint is to look at the building's exterior envelope. Water is the #1 enemy of historic buildings, or any existing building for that matter. So you want to identify any causes for water infiltration or areas in the roof, gutter systems, windows and doors, your exterior walls, and cladding. And also identify any other immediate kind of emergency concerns, be it a structural issue or life safety concerns. Next slide, please. And we do various types of assessment approaches, but in every assessment that we do, documentation is a really important tool. So that's usually detailed photography as well as annotated drawings of conditions. Here's an example from one of our really wonderful consultants on mission churches, plaster conservators, who documented the existing remnants of the colonial plaster on the exterior bell tower and facade of the church, and produced really useful detailed drawings of those existing remnants. And documentation like this helps us not just have a record of these features, but also understand visually areas of deterioration or problems, and becomes a useful reference tool to look back on during and after repairs. Next slide. And here's just another example from one of the missions projects showing how we use photography and notations to create that record of not only the existing conditions, but also note where we want to carry out treatments. And next slide. And then our project teams also make use of what are called non-destructive evaluation techniques. So in addition to your visual assessment, these are approaches to usually trying to understand what's going on inside a building, be it in the walls, in the roof structure. So we use techniques such as laser scanning, infrared thermography, which is a way to map temperatures in a wall at any given time that can tell you, often can find hidden elements, or looking for water issues, moisture. Temperature often correlates to moisture. And then something called ground penetrating radar, which is an example of what you see here, which can help identify hidden elements as well as voids in walls or other types of building systems. And so here you see the dome at Mission Concepcion, where our structural engineer used ground penetrating radar to map areas of voids in the masonry. And this allowed our team to establish kind of priorities for the structural stabilization work and identify and pinpoint the areas that needed the most attention. Next slide. And we also make use of more kind of invasive assessment techniques, which are referred to as destructive evaluation as opposed to non-destructive evaluation, although you're always very careful that you're only removing elements and finishes that's really necessary to assess the condition, the underlying condition. So here we see an example where there was plaster on an interior wall of a church that was cracked, and a suspicion that there may be an issue, a bigger issue underlying that. So we took off a select area of plaster and then found some cracking in that brick wall. So this allows us to understand better, and certainly our whole team to understand better what the problems are, what's causing them, and where we need to make repairs. These kind of techniques also include taking finishes or elements from a building for testing. So this often is mortar analysis, so small samples of mortar to be tested by a lab. We also do historic paint analysis, which is really helpful when you're trying to restore an interior back to a particular period of significance. And then once we have all of this information from our assessments, we can create recommendations for treatments and repair, and then move into the design process. So I'll hand that over to Allison next.
All right, next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the preservation, design, and construction process and our approach to that. So like Anna said, when we finish with our condition assessment, we take that, we have a meeting with the owner, and we establish, try to establish a scope of work. And we work based on our findings of the assessment. We develop a list of priorities with the owner that kind of set forth our project, right? This also helps us budget. Maybe some of the priorities are more emergency conditions that we need to address right away. So maybe the budget gets eaten up with all of those things and not the fun, pretty things that we all want to do. But sometimes, the budget is substantial and we can accomplish it all. So it's really having these hard discussions about, okay, what's our budget? What do we need to do to get this building back into habitable conditions? Because that's really the ultimate goal, is that we want to see these buildings occupied, used. I mean, an empty building is not a happy building. Other questions that we ask ourselves when we're kind of establishing the scope of work is, will this building retain its original use, or will it have a compatible use and be adapted, or is it potentially a non-compatible use? So on the screen, you'll see an example of a compatible reuse. So this is the Ruiz house. The upper left is a historic photo. It was originally located in downtown, right across from City Hall, where I've been spending the last few years of my life working on that building. But the Ruiz house was threatened with demolition in the 1940s. And Mr. Ruiz was a very important figure in San Antonio's history. And so people rallied to save the building, and they had it deconstructed and reconstructed at the Whitty Museum. So the section drawing that you see in the bottom left is from the construction drawings in the 40s when the building was deconstructed and rebuilt. Now, relocation of a building is not necessarily something that is endorsed. It's kind of a last last ditch effort to save a building. Your building is threatened with demolition because basically when you remove a building from its original site, you lose all that context. And that context is part of what makes that building significant. Not just that it's associated with an important person or that it has important character defining features. It's that, you know, it was built in that location for a reason, and everything that got built around it contributes to its context. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but back to compatible uses. So the Ruiz house was relocated to the Whitty Museum and was used as a pottery studio gallery space in the 40s, which is the picture in the bottom right hand. And then our firm was fortunate enough to get to work on a restoration of it in 2006. And so that's the picture in the upper right-hand corner. So this is just a great example of not the original use. I mean, originally, obviously, it was a house, and then it was a general store and an ice house, which were also compatible uses, frankly, especially in the downtown area. But pottery studio, gallery, they've used it as a gift shop most recently. All compatible uses. I had a hard time thinking of what a non-compatible use would be because I guess most of our projects are always compatible, but I don't know. I don't know what a non-compatible use. I couldn't think of a good example, so if you have one, put it in the chat. So the other things we try to look at are, you know, is your building designated? Is it a landmark? Is it within a historic district? As Anna mentioned, all of those factors play into how you approach the restoration or the rehabilitation of a building. The other thing that I mentioned was budget and contingencies. Contingencies are a very special part of the budget when it comes to a historic building. It's money that you set aside for those unknowns. I always say if I had X-ray vision and I could look through walls and find the problems before they're uncovered during the middle of construction, I would be a millionaire. But unfortunately, I don't have that superpower, so I have to have contingencies in my budget to deal with those leaky pipes and structural issues that we just can't see when we're doing those conditions assessments. Sometimes we don't get even lucky enough to do those removals that Anna was showing pictures of. So even in your own house, have a contingency, have that slush fund that you can dip into when you find something that you didn't know was there. Okay, let's move on. Next slide. So as part of what Anna talked a lot about having a good team of consultants. So during design, we always try to work with engineers who know what they're doing when it comes to historic buildings, historic materials. Means picking that structural engineer who understands historic limestone, picking the conservators that understand historic plaster. Even your electrician, electrical engineer, having those creative engineers who are willing to come up with a design that enhances the building and doesn't have those modern features detract. The same goes for picking your general contractor, your subcontractors. You want the guys who are creative, the ones who are willing to crawl in that crawl space and do the project right and not have the Band-Aid solution. So thankfully in San Antonio, we are very fortunate to have a lot of skilled craftspeople and laborers who understand these older building technologies and are willing to do the job right. Some cities are not as lucky. Sometimes we do projects outside of San Antonio and we take our team of subcontractors with us when it calls for it. So anyway, that's very important. I'll also say that it's important to do mock-ups during the construction phase. Having a clear understanding of what the end result is and having everyone on the same page can save you time and money. If you get to the end of a phase and they've painted a wall that doesn't match the mock-up, you can go back to the mock-up and say, look, this is what we all agreed to. This is not what you have delivered. And you've got something to stand on. So mock-ups are key. Also, clear communication on what material you want to remain versus what needs to be removed is very, very key. So if you can walk through your space and identify if something needs to be demoed, clearly identify it, because you would hate to show up on your project site and have something have been removed that was like the most precious character defining feature of the project. And now it's in the dumpster and it's down the street and, everybody's crying. So clear communication and designation of what needs to go. I would also say having a great relationship with your regulatory bodies. So these three logos on the bottom of the screen, your the fantastic Office of Historic Preservation, the Texas Historical Commission. Those two are the two we deal the most with here in San Antonio. Make those people your best friends because they are here to help you. They have the same goal. They want to see your building activated and lived in and enjoyed by generations. National Park Service comes in when things like tax credits, as well as the Texas Historical Commission. And same thing, they're equally eager to help. So make those people, go to them with questions. They are willing to help. Okay, next slide. So we want to talk about the retention of historic materials. So our overall ethos is that it's better to repair something than to completely replace it. Replacement is the last resort, right? So the character defining features are those which make your building unique and special. And so you want to try to maintain those, right? You want to be able to say that that is the door that Sam Houston knocked on when he came to call and, you know, he opened that door. You would hate to lose that door, right? So this example that you see on the screen is from City Hall here in San Antonio. On the right-hand side, you've got an original 1888 piece of carved limestone. This is a photo from our assessment before we did the restoration. So it was before cleaning and things, you know, other repair work that was done. But it's a great comparison because on the left-hand side, you see a restored piece of carved stone. So they did a project in the 1990s that was a masonry restoration of City Hall. And some of these pieces that you see on the right were in much worse condition. And so they felt at that time that I guess the one on the left was not salvageable. So they made that hard decision to go ahead and replace it with a freshly carved piece. And so that was kind of when we did our assessment for this project that started in 2018, we had to make similar judgment calls, right? So we took a look at the one on the right and it doesn't look great, but it's actually in pretty decent shape compared to other pieces around the building. So we were able to like touch the one up on the right, do some patching, things like that to maintain it because you want to have as much of the original character and materials as possible. So things that you'll deal with in masonry are, you know, obviously the material itself, the grout, and I talked about testing, just getting a mason who's willing to color match to your original mortar color is very important. Doing Dutchman repair where necessary, you know, sometimes you don't, you know, the whole stone isn't deteriorated, maybe just the corner. You can take out a section and put in a new piece. So that's being very honest with, hey, this one corner had to be replaced, so that's not original. So those are kind of things we do sometimes. You want to go to the next slide, Ms. Rachel? Windows. I'm going to get on my window soapbox. So this is a wood window. Windows are part of what keeps the water out of the building. So not only like your roof, I mean, it's one of the most important pieces of your envelope, right? If you don't maintain your windows, water's going to get in, bugs are going to get in, you know, this screwdriver you see in the photo, I was able to stick it completely through the wood onto the interior of the building. I mean, and these windows have been restored 12 years prior to when we did our assessment. So they were not maintained. They did not keep up the paint, the sealants, that is your first line of defense. So, you know, you end up replacing historic material if you don't maintain it. So, and your windows are like part of the face of your building. If you change your windows, you change the character of the building, which nobody wants to do. And everybody wants to keep water out. So maintain those windows. Okay. Next slide. I'll get off my window soapbox. We talked a little bit about ornamental issues. This is an ornamental plaster ceiling that's inside City Hall in the mayor's office. And you can see that, you know, over time, this was all covered, by the way, when we started the project. And Rachel and I uncovered it by chance. And so we had to, of course, expose it for all the world to see. Hadn't been seen, well, it was original to 1927. To that renovation project, and who knows when it was covered, but it hadn't been seen for decades. So it's very exciting that it's now been exposed, and you can see all the holes that have been cut over time for different parts and pieces. And we were able to patch that, replicate some of these medallions with plaster craftsmen. You can see this white section here in the center. That's a replacement piece that was put in, and we had to work with the craftsmen to have molds made. And it's a very worthwhile pursuit, because this is obviously a very important character defining feature of City Hall. So it's worth it to go the extra mile. I'll go to the next one, Miss Rachel. Please. And then we talked about mock-ups and how important those are, and paint analysis. So this is an example of, again, City Hall. We had a paint analysis done when we started the design phase, and we uncovered some great finishes, that decorative finishes that were in City Hall, in the main lobby and in the mayor's office. On the right, you'll see the mayor's office, and on the left is the historic lobby on the first floor. And so we had mock-ups done when we were in construction of those decorative finishes, just to make sure that everything was just, we were taking it back to what it was in 1927. On the left, you'll see that historic stenciling. Largely those panels were restored, but we did have to do things like add sprinklers and light fixtures. So you'll see that big white piece as a patch. So we use that as an opportunity to do a mock-up of what the replicated stencil would look like. So then we had that to go back to and refer back to. This is what we expect. So it's really important to, and the paint analysis is fun, right? Like, who wouldn't want to know what the original color of their windows were? So that's kind of when the fun historic part comes out, the history, and who was the last people to see this stenciling, and isn't it great that we're getting to bring it back? So I think I'll turn it over to you, Miss Rachel.
Great. I am going to take a couple minutes to talk about the importance of sensitive integration of modern systems in historic buildings. And by modern systems, I mean like your air conditioning, your lighting, your fire protection, your AV, all of those kind of things. This image is also from City Hall, because that's what Allison and I are doing right now. So you get a lot of City Hall examples. You can see on the left all of the stuff that's up in the ceiling, right? Like everything that we're having to deal with when we're integrating systems into the building. We've got ductwork, we've got conduit, we've got the sprinkler piping, all of those things. And then on the right, you can see the final product. And we were able to keep everything above the historic crown molding in there, and then come in and replace the plaster ceiling. So how do we do this? How do we integrate modern systems? First and foremost, like Allison touched on earlier, we believe that the best historic building is one that's being used. So that means we have to integrate today's modern systems into the building fabric, right? Like Anna touched on with the missions, we work in places that have had like active parishes or congregations for hundreds of years, right? And while these buildings didn't originally have air conditioning, it's South Texas and it's hot. And in order for those to continue being active parishes, they need to be conditioned. But that impacts the building in a bunch of ways, right? Like you have to remove historic materials to install the systems. The historic structural system might not be sufficient. The system might cause new moisture to be introduced into historic materials and damage them. So lots of things to consider. So how do we do this well? Allison and I like to joke that if we've done a good job, you won't know that we were there, right? And so the first step is getting qualified consultants who understand this. And I know we've touched on this already, but I'm going to harp on it because a quality structural engineer and a quality MEP engineer are invaluable, right? And I know there's one on the call right now. Hi, Karina. Shout out to Karina at ABC. But people who really understand that we are working with historic structures, and people who are willing to be creative in their solutions. And like Allison mentioned, this extends to contractors and subcontractors. It extends to your electricians, your plumbers, your masons. Like, this is not new construction. These people need the experience and the creativity and the desire to work with historic materials. Second is you have to consider the building holistically, right? Installing HVAC isn't about air conditioning. It's about how am I going to conceal ductwork above a plaster ceiling? How am I going to size this system correctly without vapor barriers in my historic walls? How am I going to install a system knowing that I'm going to have to replace it in 20 years? So not just having good experienced consultants, but having good communication and good brainstorming with these consultants. And then the last point I wanted to make about integration of modern systems is that you have to prioritize, right? We have to determine which spaces and which finishes and which features are significant so that we can make sure that we preserve those. But we also have to identify the appropriate secondary spaces for housing things, right? Like, so your attics, your basements, your closets, ceiling or floor cavities, as you can see at City Hall, these kind of things. I have one other example that I kind of wanted to talk about in terms of systems. I kind of debated showing this because this is not our typical preservation project. This building didn't have any historic finishes left when we took it on. So we opted to highlight the historic material that remained, in this case, cast iron columns and wood joists. There's also some masonry walls in this project. So I just want to be clear by showing this. I'm not advocating for ripping down ceilings to show wood joists or tearing down historic plaster walls to show masonry. It just happens to be that in this case, those things didn't exist for us to investigate and take cues from, which is a really roundabout way of saying, like, we don't really have typical preservation projects, right? Like, there are standards, there are guidelines, but at each project we look at carefully and develop an approach for. So in this specific photograph, I wanted to talk about kind of our, I don't know, can you guys see my mouse, Anna and Allison? Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So all of the HVAC systems in this space are located above this bathroom core right here with some black linear diffusers that are up here in this black band. And then we have this painted black band also at the bottom, which houses all of our electrical outlets. We also have a sleeper floor above this wood decking up here. So we were able to put all of the conduit for lighting and all of the piping for sprinklers above the wood decking, and it pops out at each individual. You can kind of see a sprinkler head there. Anyway, so we were able to not have exposed ductwork. We don't have exposed conduit. And this strategy took us many hours with many consultants to navigate and negotiate. And so I really just wanted to take a quick look at what you're not seeing in this picture, right? So talking about systems, I think is a good transition to talking a little bit about our last piece of our talk, which is to discuss maintenance. It's not always glamorous, but I am super passionate about maintenance. The old adage goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that is so true with existing buildings. If existing materials are maintained and deterioration is reduced, then the integrity and the workmanship in the historic building is protected. It's also the most cost-effective method for extending the life of your building. And if you wait until a material has deteriorated, typically there's a rush to fix the problem. And if you're doing work like that, where you're trying to do it quickly and you're in a crisis mode, that often can lead to inappropriate work or damaging the historic material. So for our projects, we like to create a maintenance plan that includes schedules for maintenance and schedules for inspection. In addition to schedules, we like to include forms for recording the work that's done, for record keeping, and we write specific procedures for the various materials. The procedures can include things like housekeeping, routine or cyclical items, and preventative measures. And this slide is just kind of a glimpse at what these plans can kind of look like. An important part of maintenance and upkeep is understanding the materials. Some materials might be marketed as quote unquote maintenance free. I will tell you, there is no such thing as maintenance free. All materials will deteriorate. So we identify the materials, right? You have wood windows and brick masonry and a wood shingle roof. Like, what does that mean? How are those materials appropriately repaired? How are they replaced and how frequently? This table is a good example of items which need inspection and repair and kind of an idea of their cyclical nature. So you have items like roof and chimneys that need to be looked at and repaired annually. Other items which are more frequent, like every 4 months or after a major storm. This table is from Preservation Brief of 47, which Anna mentioned earlier. This one is maintaining the exterior of small and medium-sized historic buildings, which I highly recommend taking a look at if you are caring for a historic home or a small commercial building. This last slide is just a couple images of deferred maintenance leading to deterioration. We've got obviously gutters that need to be cleaned out, repointing and repainting that's been neglected, repairs to windows that need to be done because of neglect. When we were putting this presentation together, we kind of debated about leaving maintenance for the last part of the preservation because, like I said, it's not the most exciting. I don't have all the pretty photos, but it really is the most important thing that you can do for a historic property. And like the three of us say, you know, if everybody was doing all of their maintenance, we would be out of jobs. So with that, Katie, I think we're ready to take any questions.
Awesome. That was fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. So one of the first questions actually that popped up, and I'm curious too, at one of the first slides, Anna, that you were talking about, there was several pictures. The question was, what was the picture at the top middle? It looked like it was a roof or a ceiling. It was yellow.
That was the restored ceiling of the lobby at City Hall. So you saw some of the during pictures that Allison showed.
Okay.
But let's see.
Which one? This one?
That one.
Yeah.
That one, yeah.
Yeah, so
It's a restored stenciled ceiling from 1927. When we started the project, the plaster was all visible, but the whole ceiling had been painted white. But all of that was underneath there. And so we uncovered it and had it replicated in some locations, and replicated the finish that was not stenciled. It's kind of a pounced textural finish. So it's beautiful. I want everybody to go and see it.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, that's phenomenal. Very cool. And then we had some really great comments for the non-compatible uses for the Ruiz house. So somebody said a horse stable, hot yoga, bus station, mechanics garage. Those are all good examples, I think.
Yeah, which we could all probably find in our city, actually.
Sure. Yeah, and you often see, I'll say one thing we didn't really touch on is the whole, because this could be easily its own lecture, if not, many people have written about it. There's books about it, but additions to historic buildings. And I feel like, you often see questionable uses, compatible uses when there's something that I know a lot of people in preservation talk about facadism, when a building, just the exterior facade is saved, but it's totally gutted and some addition put onto it. I mean, that's something that happened, I think, more frequently in the 80s and 90s. But
it's still happening.
It still happens now with existing buildings, but that's kind of a whole nother topic.
Yeah, we could do a whole lecture on that.
For sure. Yeah. Okay, one other question. I've got a couple. The next one is, so other than, and I can probably touch on this too, other than Scott's list, how do you know your contractor's qualified to work on a historic structure? So I know that, our department does have a list of individuals that do are familiar with working on properties in historic districts specifically. And that can be found on our Rehabber Club website, which is sarehabberclub.com, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. But how do y'all, I guess, vet or otherwise, determine if somebody's, I guess qualified is the best word, to have the experience to work on historic structures, whether they're designated or not?
So we try to pre-qualify on our commercial projects whenever it's allowed, which means that we want, if it's not a subcontractor that we're familiar with, then we ask them to provide us examples of projects that are similar to the one they're about to embark on. And then references, of course, we would call references when we can, to make sure that they know what they're getting into, right?
I will also say the three of us all live in a historic neighborhood together, and I personally know the pains of having a historic home that needs some love and finding qualified people to do that. Scott's List is great. I will also say that Nextdoor or Facebook, like if you have a neighborhood Facebook group, people will pass around qualified individuals all the time, and that I've found a lot of people personally doing it that way. And I can't speak enough also for having a friendly preservationist to help you. So we don't do a lot of residential, but we are willing to help people figure out how to take care of those kind of things. So I think those are all some great resources.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. And then we had a question about paint analysis. Where could, as a homeowner, where could somebody go to do that, or who should they contact, or how would someone even go about doing that for their home?
Well, if you wanted to do it on your own, your best friend is an X-Acto knife, and you look for areas where commonly, like if hopefully it hasn't been stripped of the paint over, but sometimes paint is stripped back and then coat's applied. But if it hasn't been stripped, look for those areas like on walls, like around light switches. Sometimes if you take off a light switch, you can remove a section of plaster or drip board and find older colors. Those little crevices in windows, sometimes those don't get cleaned well, and you can find the older colors.
Corners of door surrounds often. Yeah, and honestly, the unofficial way of doing this. So there's kind of the lab based where you have someone who has a microscope. They can pigment match. Those are for really kind of high profile preservation projects. But on a lot of our ones, we're really just trying to find kind of what was the existing color scheme in previous periods. As Allison says, you take an X-Acto knife and you try to find some of those layers intact. And you look at those under a jeweler's loupe, and you can generally see kind of those basic colors. And then if you want to match them, we use something called the Munsell color system, which is a universal color annotation system. And then you can actually get, you can get Sherman-Williams, Benjamin Moore, whatever the brand at Lowe's or Home Depot, and they'll match those to those Munsell numbers. But there are, paint conservation specialists if you're wanting something really, particularly really highly accurate that can provide those services. But they're kind of few and far between. But we certainly know we know some that we could pass along if anyone is interested. So yeah.
Awesome, cool. And then there was also a question that came up. Do you guys have any companies or know individuals who work specifically with the metal casement windows or the crank windows? I know that's something that I've been trying to find folks who do that here locally. But if you guys had any suggestions on that?
Well, the people we worked with most recently are from Fort Worth, and they just did all the metal windows at City Hall. Well, there's some metal windows at City Hall that they did, but they do much larger projects. For smaller, yeah, it's hard. I don't know that I have a good name, but I could look for one.
Yeah,
There's
something we come across, we'll certainly.
if somebody wants to open a business that restores metal windows, we will hire you.
We'll pass them along to you, Katie, if we hear of anyone.
Thank you. Yes, hopefully I can find somebody and maybe bring them down to do a workshop when we start doing those in person. So yes, sorry, Gemma, I couldn't answer your question, but yeah, if I find someone, I'll reach out to you.
I know some commercial ones, but yeah, smaller mom and pop shops it's few and far between.
But yeah, it's a really good, a need, because we certainly have lots of those windows around town.
Especially with mid-century modern buildings coming of age.
Yeah.
There's a lot more metal windows that need work.
Perfect. Let's see, what else do I have? So we've got another one. In your experience, what are currently the top 3 or 4 challenges to maintaining historic structures in your work? And do you see the impacts of climate change locally accelerating deterioration?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's actually something that I've been grappling with the last, at least definitely 5 years with the mission churches, and something that everyone involved in the World Heritage Sites has been kind of aware of. We do seem to be having increased moisture issues, just kind of the extremity of that. It has to do with a variety of factors, but the kind of more intense periods of drought followed by more intense periods of rain it does seem to have an impact on the really soft lime mortar and really soft limestone. So this was part of our rationale when we created the maintenance plan for the missions in 2018. It was actually part of something that we had promised to help with during the World Heritage nomination process. And that's why having such regular cyclical maintenance becomes even more important in those projects. But I'll let Allison and Rachel add anything else regarding that.
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on what you were saying, Anna, which is like global warming also has the extreme colds also, right? Like you're talking extremes on either side of the temperature. And so when you have materials that have been around for hundreds of years and are used to kind of going through, these kind of cycles, and all of a sudden we're talking about these kind of cycles, like this winter storm that we just had, it's impacting the materials for sure.
Yeah, definitely accelerating deterioration.
Yeah, but I think in general, in terms of just kind of the most critical maintenance issues, is really what we said before, which is maintaining your exterior envelope. So making sure things are watertight the way they're intended to be. Cleaning out gutters, it's an annoying thing to do, but really doing that quarterly is one of the most important things you can do. I climb up on my parents' roof at least twice a year and clean off the corners where debris, kind of tends to gather. But those things, and really repainting
Paint your windows. Paint your windows.
If you have wood siding, repaint that regularly.
Prep it too before you paint it. Make sure that you're getting down to a good solid surface.
Don't be fooled by a maintenance-free vinyl siding. It's as Rachel says, there's nothing that's maintenance-free. And then, another important thing I think is understanding what pests are, not a big deal for your property, but what are. So understanding, how to look for potential termite activity. Carpenter ants can be an issue. So understanding what things can become that might be a hidden problem, but there might be some things you can look for. So working with people that understand those signs is important as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Couple more. Was robin's egg blue a primer color that you guys know of? Robin says it's on the trim in her 1928 house.
I do not know. I'm not the paint expert. I know about some paint history, but I haven't heard that one before. It doesn't mean that it's not true, but
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like generally the primers that we've come across tend to be more in the, white, off-white, gray.
red, like
Sometimes, yeah, depending on the material, if you have a metal, metal primers are sometimes
red or
red or
brown.
brown. But on wood or plaster, generally not something of that color, but it might have been. There are times we've been stumped by base colors on things, and we're like, what could that have been, a primer? So, for example, the top of the brew house at the Pearl, we did the exterior restoration work there, which was many years before it was actually converted into Hotel Emma. But if anyone remembers that brew house, just the roof structures, those mansard roof structures were a kind of orangey yellow color for most of the later part of the 20th century. And we did some paint analysis. We scraped off samples. We looked at that under microscopes, and we kept finding this black as the base color. And I found it like, why would black have been a primer? That seems a little strange. But it wasn't until they started doing stripping large bits of paint off of that metal roof that we realized it was stamped metal to look like slate shingles. And so the paint color originally was actually that kind of black gray color. So it looked like slate. But it was one of those it took several steps to understand the history of those paint layers.
Cool. That's awesome.
My favorite story to tell when I'm out at the Pearl with other people.
Let's see. Okay, last question I've got in the chat. What training or education is necessary for a job in historic preservation? And it's very broad.
That's very broad because
from y'all's perspective.
I mean,
maybe we could talk about what some of the options are, not necessarily the requirements. I will say that my bachelor's degree is in architecture, and so I graduated with a B.Arch. I went to work for an architecture firm in San Antonio that happens to do some preservation, and fell in love with preservation there, and then went on to do my master's degree in HP. So I kind of came into it that way. And I know Allison has got a similar story in that she is an architect who pursued a master's degree. It's handy in our office to be an architect, but not everyone is. Like Anna has a different tool set. And that's private sector, right? Like we're just talking about somebody in an architecture firm, and then there are people like Katie who have other spots in the world in terms of preservation and what they do. So I feel like it's a huge kind of gamut of what you can do. There's nonprofits. Anyway, I'll pass it off to you guys. Those are just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I was generally what I would tell my students when I was teaching was there's really the three areas of way you can work as a preservation, which is the private sector, like what we do in the design world. There's also, the more hands-on conservator type. So we work with lots of skilled conservators who work with specific materials. Then there's obviously the public sector. So like everyone who works at the city's preservation office is a public sector of preservation. And that's probably the largest, I think, kind of one of the larger employment sides of preservation, because every major city has a preservation department of some kind. Every state has a state historic preservation office or a SHPO. The Park Service employs a fair number of preservationists, not just at individual parks, but in DC. And then there's the nonprofit side. So a lot of preservation focused nonprofits, but also, we don't, I think a lot of preservationists are trying to help the public understand that we're not just about house museums and very kind of a narrow definition of what a historic building is. We're really built environment specialists, and we're the specialists for any existing building. So it's not just about the really high significance or well-known historic sites. It's about the everyday buildings, and there's a lot of ways to be involved and be an advocate for preservation without necessarily being in kind of a more high-profile job position, if that makes sense.
I parallel being a preservationist with being an environmentalist, right? Because I feel like people can understand that more often, right? You can be an environmentalist and that can be your career. That can be like what you do every day. You can do that private sector, you can do that public sector. It's a variety. Preservation is the same thing, right? Like it's not the natural environment, it's the built environment. But you can be an advocate for that with no degree, right? Like that, being a preservationist and advocating for preservation and advocating for a built environment, anybody can do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd add that one of the most critical aspects of preservation, and one of the things that is most in dire need, is skilled tradesmen. This is true across the U.S. It's particularly true in San Antonio. We have a long history of skilled masons and carpenters, but those people are getting older and retiring, and there's not enough people there to replace them. And so one of my big kind of soapbox things in preservation is encouraging people who actually have an interest in working with their hands to really consider those fields, because it's a critical component of what we do. And we need more people in, not just locally, but around the country, who can do that. And, something that I think is a little more common in places like, France or Britain, where there's a lot larger kind of traditional historic building stock. But as we get older in the country, more and more of our existing buildings are going to be considered historic, and those skills are going to need to be adapted to more modern materials. But we need those people who understand how to work with those materials.
For sure. Actually, Robin, I love Robin's comment. She messaged me. She said, "But could a 50-year-old woman go into the trades?" I said, "Absolutely."
Yeah.
Yes.
Got a window repair specialist. You can become a plasterer. You can do whatever you want.
Decorative painter. Yeah.
I will teach you how to restore wood windows.
There you go. She can do leaded stained glass. There we go.
Yes. Let's see. I think I had one last question. Let me pull it up here. Let's see. Is polyurethane an appropriate clear sealer for interior trims that were previously shellacked, specifically in like private home residential?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think you just want to make sure you're looking at the volatile organic compound rating, or VOC, which should be in the manufacturer's safety data sheet. Sometimes it's on the, whatever the container is, but there's certain standards for basically chemicals that you should be breathing in or not. So that's always a good thing to look at before you use any product on the inside of your house.
And you want to make sure that you prep the material appropriately first, right? Like remove any alligatoring. I mean, things that were shellacked, it's almost like with a fine piece of furniture. So you just have to be careful.
We have a term, which is you want to make sure that you're preparing the surface to sound and tight. So you're getting rid of anything that's really loose or is, going to come through on the new finish and disturb that, that finished look.
Awesome. Perfect. Great. I think that's all the questions. I dropped this in the chat, but if anybody comes up with any other questions, you can certainly email me and I can pass on those to Anna, Rachel, and Allison. So my email address is katie@sapreservation.com. And thank you guys so much. That was amazing. And I learned so much. I always do. And we had some great questions. So thank you. And I will be sending out, as I mentioned, an email probably early next week with a link to this recording. and also a survey of our presentation, just to let us know what you think, if you have any other ideas for other talks that we might be able to provide, and more information about June's upcoming talk. And I'll have a link for the registration in that. And yeah, so thank you everybody for joining, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.